it gave us an edge in terms of starting to think of how we could actually talk about the sector in a way that sector could come together and start saying we have something that unifies us. And it was with the work of the Winnipeg Foundation, the United Way, who came to the same table with all the various government departments, ourselves, immigrant settlement agencies, where we started to say we need to go further and we need to start to actually engage the sector about what we need to understand about its labor market. And our first survey was being prepped to actually take form, and there's a copy of it now in front of you, that actually gave us the first evidence about what our labor market was about. First time in Manitoba. In a sense, it was working nationally with the Human Resource Council, but we actually had some evidence finally to say, this is our sector. We had information before about the number of organizations, the various traits of organizations. We knew, and we now know, we have 8,200 organizations in our sector, 4,500 in Winnipeg, approximately 2,000 health and social services in Winnipeg, but we didn't know anything about our labor market. And now we know where we need to actually start to actually focus our attention. It is very much around labor market issues of recruitment and retention. It is about vacancies. It is about being able to actually understand the skills development, but ultimately it's how do we actually strengthen our labor market, our skilled employees, so we can actually deliver better service that's not just more effective, but also accountable, very much in terms of what Susan's actually talking about. And so we moved forward, and actually by becoming a labor market organization, a sector council, we automatically became a member of the Alliance of Manitoba Sector Councils, and were finally recognized as the 18th industrial sector of Manitoba. By doing that, I think it actually allowed government to start to say, there's a new way of thinking about the nonprofit sector. Not necessarily just talking about money, talking about the accountability, but now it's about labor market. And I believe very much it's focused on the fact that labor market issues are across all 18 sector councils. We're absolutely no different. However, we have challenges a lot of the other labor markets don't face, but we needed to start to address them. Now in Canada, and the context is really important, Quebec is very much ahead of the game in terms of how they have framed their labor market around social economy. I think Ontario, through some of the networks, are framing some of that discussion, but there really hasn't been real research locally around that conversation, except for the HR Council's work. Alberta has an HR Council, very much focused on the same kind of work we're doing, and we can talk a bit more about that. And BC has started the conversation, but they don't have actually a structure to focus long-term. So Manitoba's in a very positive position, talking about something that becomes really important long-term and short-term. As a member of the Alliance, and also because we actually had, I think, the years of government, and it was Paul, but also 5 ministers that were engaged, and various officials of various governments, we actually started a process to talk about how are we going to name ourselves as being important as a sector in a way that the community understands what we're talking about. In 2010, we were named in the throne speech as a sector that the government actually identified as being incredibly important and recognized its value for the first time ever that I ever saw in a throne speech. And that's in terms of what happened across Canada, except for Quebec. The second part is the government also agreed it was going to identify and work with the sector in terms of 3 pilots. And the first pilot was actually a simplification of funding arrangements in terms of being able to actually be able to write proposals for funding and be able to solicit it. And in a sense, my word is a universal application model. The second part is how government can actually work to simplify accountability. Third part was actually to identify a multi-year funding idea and how that would work. And we're still in contact with government to figure out what does that look like, how is it actually starting to take form, and how do we work with government to understand how we can learn from that process together. And that started in 2010, and we're just moving on that process now, because government has made some changes based on the last election, and it's going to take some time to form it properly. But also, very importantly, from my point of view, 2011, the Minister of Entrepreneurship, Training and Trade announced that they would have a member from the nonprofit sector who would be a member of the Minister's Advisory Council on Workforce Development. And we have that now. So we're in the mix of all the other labor sectors talking about workforce development in Manitoba for the first time. That's the only place in Canada where that's happening. So I do congratulate the government to move forward on that initiative. I think that's very, very important. And in terms of the work we're doing, we just actually finished a colloquium in February to talk about what our future is and how we actually start to engage in terms of what the sector is telling us that we need to act on. So I'll get back to that in a second. So why is this topic important for us? And I think what's really important is that there really are, I think, 4 areas that make sense to us in thinking about what the future is all about. And that one, I think, relies heavily on some of the points that Susan raised about how do we define ourselves vis-a-vis government? What are we there to do? How are we there to behave? What is our role? How we even say who we are? What is our name? What is our sector? What do we call ourselves? Still not known, because we use voluntary sector, we use nonprofit, we use third sector. So what is our name and how do we name our future without really knowing clearly about who we represent? Second one is that this topic really is important in terms of how government and the sector works together, because we're also talking about the transfer of knowledge. And I think that's really important between government and the sector, about the relationship, and probably more importantly, about how we've actually had a history of working together. And that is really important. We don't have a place that actually has demonstrated that we've collected that knowledge. And to some extent, what's really important from our position, it's not just for the officials of government and the sector, but it's also for future politicians to understand the nature of who we are and where we fit. And there's some real important issues that we'll be addressing in the future, plus our staff, our board members. But I think it's really important in the context to think about also future politicians and how they view civil society. And there's somewhat of, I think, a notion of what's happening in the US that is informing us in terms of how the nonprofit sector and civil society is being viewed south of us, which may have an impact in Canada at some point in time. It's a concern. What I think is also important, and I think it does come down to the fact that without really defining it, there is a natural tension between government and the sector in terms of how do we hold ourselves accountable and what roles do we take on, and is it only in terms of how we actually are supported by government and funded by government, or is it more than that? There is a real notion in our sector that some of us believe within the sector that there is a role for government as an enabling organization or set of organizations to support the sector to deliver services to citizens, and others believe strongly that it's really very much around charity and that we need to actually work with donors, and it is a charitable notion and format that we should be applying. There is a tension that continues to go back and forth, and we see that in literature, and we see that in terms of how some of our leaders see that as well. And there isn't an answer for that, but ultimately, is it around the different expectations and accountabilities of how we actually operate and what is our role in society to deliver services? If you think about it, and I think what's really important is to know that we are big. We're not just the 18th sector, industrial sector, but we believe in our research we have 100,000 employees. And we're not talking in terms of institutions, universities, municipalities. We know from the first research, 33,000 employees in health and social service community-based organizations. Our second deployment is taking place with next year, but we also know from other research, it's a pretty good venture to believe that we're 100,000. Now, what does that mean in terms of being able to focus on our future, and how do we sustain 100,000 employees? Is it going to be possible? Bigger question, how many of our organizations are going to actually continue to exist in 5 to 10 years? We don't have an answer for that.